Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 10, Various Random Legal Topics. Budget for ATF. For MA20XX to be effective, it will need a sufficient number of Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, agents to investigate potential straw purchasers. Militia as terrorism extremists oppose any gun law, and purposely reduce the budget of the ATF so that even if a law restricts guns, there isn't anyone to enforce it. Remember Timothy McVeigh talking about the ATF agents who served search warrants on the Branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas, and calling those ATF agents traitors? These extremists will oppose any common-sense gun law, and they will defund the ATF to prevent those gun laws from being enforced. So, MA20XX will need to mandate a large enough budget for the ATF to be able to take gun traffickers to court and convict them. A computer system should be able to flag potential patterns of gun trafficking, but to get a conviction, you need investigators collecting evidence, getting warrants, going to court, and doing a lot of legwork. Once in a rare while, a licensed gun dealer turns out to be a source of gun trafficking. Even today, dealers are required to do background checks on all gun sales. However, there are creative ways to get around that. So, MA20XX will need to be smart enough to prevent abuse. And detecting that abuse will require investigators. The only way to locate the bad gun dealers is to have enough agents to be able to perform random, surprise inspections of gun dealers, to verify they have all the firearms currently registered to them. Straw purchasers report guns stolen. As for creative ways for straw purchasers to get around universal background checks and registration, probably the most common would be buying a gun legally where it is registered to them, at some time later report it as stolen, and then selling the gun to a criminal. For this reason, MA20XX should include mandates for legal gun owners to keep their weapons secure. Keeping weapons in enclosed gun safes might be a minimum requirement. If a straw buyer can simply say they left the gun sitting on their coffee table, out in the open, with the front door unlocked, then reporting it stolen means there's little physical evidence of a break-in. If MA20XX mandates that guns cannot be left unattended in unsecured locations, but must be kept in a locked safe, that is either heavy enough to make a quick getaway impossible or must be permanently mounted to the wall, and if MA20XX also states that gun thefts must be reported immediately, then there should be a trail of physical evidence consistent with an actual break-in and property damage that the police and ATF can look for. If that physical evidence doesn't line up, it would be a red flag that the gun reported stolen was possibly a straw purchase and sold to a criminal. MA20XX might require that people who report a gun stolen from them to show a receipt for a new gun safe. Anyone who has had multiple guns stolen from them might be required to have the installation of new safe be verified by the police or ATF, etc. Anyone who keeps having guns repeatedly stolen from them should be flagged for possibly being a repeat straw buyer, and an investigator should probably look over the records to see if the reports seem fake. Which is yet another reason money needs to be budgeted to the ATF to investigate stolen firearms and make sure it's not a straw buyer trying to get around the law. Unattended firearms must be secured. Requiring unattended firearms be kept in a locked safe makes it harder for straw buyers to file false police reports. It also prevents one of the most needless tragedies in the United States, children finding a gun and hurting themselves or others. Gun safes are fairly common among gun owners, so requiring a gun safe shouldn't impose too much of an economic burden. And are the only way to prevent straw buyers from easily reporting a gun stolen to hide a straw purchase. Some gun owners may want to keep a loaded firearm nearby for home defense. That's not a right the founders intended with the Second Amendment, but it could be supported if the owner uses something like a safe that can be opened instantly with an electronic, wireless lock. The key could be in the form of a ring on their finger or bracelet on their wrist. Touching the key to the safe unlocks it instantly, allowing the owner quick access. Otherwise, the firearm remains in a locked safe, keeping it out of the hands of children, and mounting it to a wall makes it hard for thieves to walk off with it, and creates physical evidence that can root out straw buyers filing false reports. The Second Amendment is designed to allow private citizens to own a firearm so they can be called up in times of war to serve in the militia, but to go about their civilian lives in times of peace. The Second Amendment is not designed with the intention of allowing people keep loaded firearms laying about in the open in times of peace. The Second Amendment is not designed with the intention of creating an armed neighborhood watch. It is designed for arming militias subservient to the government to defend the state in times of war. Militia members are not expected to be carrying loaded firearms 24/7 during times of peace. Nor is that an intention of the Second Amendment. Stricter requirements for people owning lots of firearms. For people owning more than, say, 10 firearms, MiSSA would designate them as a militia armorer and/or dealer's license. The armorer designation would fall under the militia clause of the Constitution, the dealer designation would fall under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Both designations would have the same primary effect: stricter background checks, for one. Stricter security requirements, for another. In addition to keeping guns locked in a safe, people under the armorer or dealer designation would have to have a video security system that can record video from several angles approaching and leaving the gun safe, as well as an alarm system that immediately notifies police of possible break-in. Random ATF inspections might also be part of the package. The goal isn't to create an economic burden. Rather, the goal is to make sure straw purchasers don't buy a lot of guns, and then declare they were all stolen in one big heist, with zero physical evidence to support that. If straw buyers can do this, then one of the main benefits of MiSSA is lost. Also, to remind and clarify, MiSSA establishes a minimum requirement for militia service to be a single long gun and 40 rounds of ammo as described in an earlier video. However, MiSSA will register all guns that a person owns as allowed by their state. If the number of guns exceeds some number, say, 10, or if the number of rounds of ammunition exceeds, say, 400 rounds, or if the person always possesses less than 10 firearms and less than 400 rounds, but that person buys and sells 10 firearms in a year, or 1,000 rounds in a year, then MiSSA will designate that person an armorer and/or dealer and the extra security requirements will kick in. The exact numbers to make the thresholds reasonable would have to be sorted out by Congress, and might change over time as data comes in and shows how criminals hide their behavior. The average number of guns that a gun owner owns might be, say, 8, which might not want to set the threshold that low. However, there is the phenomenon of the gun super owner. About 2% of Americans own 50% of all guns. Which means a super owner owns a lot of guns. They would definitely be above the armorer and/or dealer threshold. A starting point might be whatever threshold would put less than 20% of gun owners into the armorer and/or dealer category, and then see how things pan out from there. One purpose of the extra security is to make sure the person actually possesses the weapons registered to them, to make sure the person isn't committing illegal gun trafficking, to make sure the person isn't a straw armorer, someone to whom a gun is registered, but the gun is actually possessed by that person's friend or relative, who can't pass a background check, and so on. If a person has a lot of weapons, then that is a lot of weapons the government may depend on in the event they have to create and activate militias. If a person has 20 or 30 or even 100 firearms registered to them, but if that person disappears with all their weapons the moment the government drafts even one of their firearms, then that behavior on a large scale could create huge shortages. For Congress to arm the militias, it needs to have some level of certainty that the people who own the firearms can be depended on to supply the firearms if the government drafts those firearms. If the person is shady, can't be trusted, then all their weapons can't really be counted on to be drafted. And from a Commerce Clause perspective, a dealer who owns, buys, and sells a lot of guns, can be regulated more strictly than an individual owner. Government tracking of guns used in crimes. There needs to be a massive overhaul of the way government tracks gun crimes. There is no central repository of information about how many crimes are committed with guns, what kind of guns, how the person got a hold of the gun, and so on. There is no mandatory reporting requirement for states to report this information to the federal government. The militia as terrorism extremists oppose collecting this information, because everyone knows the numbers for gun crimes in the US are absolutely horrible, but because we don't have hard statistical evidence, the extremists downplay it. Make it federal law that states must report to the federal government any crime committed with a gun, what kind of gun was used, its serial number, any registration information about the gun, how many shots were fired, etc. If guns used in crimes can all be traced back to a few states, that's something the Militia Act of 20XX would want to find out. It would suggest that some states aren't enforcing the law. Militias are not a neighborhood watch. The militia, the Army, and the Navy serve under the Commander-in-Chief, the President, to repel foreign invasions and to suppress internal rebellions. They do not exist as neighborhood watch groups. Unless you have putrefied yogurt for brains, no one should read the Constitution, Second Amendment, or Militia Act of 1792, and extract the idea that the founders intended for people to have a right to conceal carry or open carry a handgun at all times. Civilians registered for militia service. They trained with their state. And if the president needed them, the commander-in-chief could call up the militia for service in putting down an insurrection or repelling a foreign invasion. Being a member of a militia did not entail carrying a loaded firearm everywhere you went. In the Militia Act of 1792, every able-bodied man had to register for militia service. The idea that in 1792, every able-bodied man had to carry around a loaded firearm at all times is tainted truffles. Maybe if the militia were put on high alert, then militia members might keep their arms at the ready. But in times of peace, the militia members went back to their civilian lives and put their arms away. States can decide whether to allow concealed carry or open carry. If and how they implement that is up to them. But neither open, nor concealed carry, during peacetime by inactive militia members is a right protected by the Second Amendment. Nothing in the Second Amendment could reasonably be taken to mean the founders wanted every able-bodied man to be armed every moment of every day during times of peace. MA-20XX could require a stricter background check for people who own concealable firearms, such as handguns. And if a state wants to allow concealed or open carry, that is up to the state. But if a state wants to prohibit concealed and open carry, during times of peace, nothing in the founders' intentions with regards to the Second Amendment and militias was ever meant to enable militia members to be armed 24/7. Furthermore, the idea that the Second Amendment is intended to guarantee a right to self-defense, and therefore a right to open or conceal carry a firearm to fight off criminals is canker cake. The Constitution, Second Amendment, and Militia Act of 1792 make clear that militias supplement the Army, are subservient to the government, operate under the Commander-in-Chief the President, and exist to be called up when needed to repel foreign invasions or suppress insurrections. The militia does not exist as an armed neighborhood watch. Neither the military nor militia operate as a domestic police force. And if you somehow extracted that meaning from the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and MA 1792, you should have your doctor check you for brain blight. Local law enforcement can't be counted on to enforce federal law. 48 state constitutions specifically declare militias to be subservient to, and operating under, the state government. And yet private, anonymous, paramilitary groups operating outside government control are operating in many states and call themselves militias. They're not militias. But often, enforcement of such laws are in the scope of local sheriffs. And sheriffs are often elected officials. And militia as terrorism extremists can be extremely political. And when the rest of the population is ambivalent about local elections, but a small, but extreme group is politically motivated, that small group can dominate politics. And so, it is not uncommon to see sheriffs who choose not to enforce laws that prohibit paramilitary groups, for fear of losing election. And it is not uncommon to see militia as terrorism extremists manage to push into office sheriffs who are themselves militia as terrorism extremists. Several states have tried passing laws that forbid local law enforcement from enforcing what the state deems to be unconstitutional firearms laws. This mostly means that the state government doesn't understand the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Militia Act of 1792, and more importantly doesn't know the least bit of actual American history. But all of this is yet another reason that ATF budgets must be large enough to support enforcing federal law, because locally elected sheriffs can't be counted on to enforce federal law where militia as terrorism extremists are politically active. And because state governments who want to enable Jacobin mob rule for political gain, can't be counted on to interpret the Constitution in anything but a "it means only what we want it to mean" sort of way. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.